We live in a time right now where everybody is so immersed. They're online a lot and they're immersed in information from so many different sources. But there's not a lot of sources of information about what's happening right here in your town.
I'm Justin Silverman of the New England First Amendment Coalition. The following conversation is brought to you in part by the Society of Professional Journalists Foundation, which supports our First Amendment and free press program, where we discuss the value that local journalism plays in our democracy. Many thanks to the SPJ Foundation for its support. I'm here today with Lisa Scagliotti, editor at the Waterbury Roundabout. Lisa, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Lisa, in a moment, I'm going to have you discuss the Roundabout and the great work that you've been doing recently. But first, I think it would be very helpful if you could provide us some background and context into the media landscape and local journalism in Waterbury, Vermont and surrounding areas. What does that look like right now?
Well, Waterbury is a little town in central Vermont. If you look on the map, it's sort of halfway between Burlington, which is Vermont's biggest city, and our state capital, Montpelier. It's a town of about 5,000 people who live here, although a lot more people work here during the day. We have a large concentration of state employees that work here. We have a Ben & Jerry's ice cream factory that a lot of people might be familiar with, a coffee processing plant. And so the population is bigger during the day than it is overall. And up until March of 2020, we had a weekly newspaper that was mailed to every mailbox in our zip codes here in Waterbury. It was called the Waterbury Record. And it had been in circulation here from 2007 until March 26th of 2020. And it was just after COVID hit that the publisher of that paper, which also publishes 5 other weekly newspapers, found itself, like a lot of newspapers did, really reeling from the blow of everything shutting down, businesses closing, events stopping, etc. And their advertising revenue just took a huge dive. And so they kind of scrambled quickly, and they decided that the cut that they were going to make was to just cut one of their newspapers. And that really had everybody in our community, it caught people off guard, it caught people by surprise, and there was a lot of just shock and concern, because it was a time when people really needed information. It was a bad time for the paper economically, understandably, but it also was a time where so much was changing and people were really needing information about what was happening, what was different, because pretty much, as you know, by now, everything is different. And so, we just all of a sudden we had this gap, this void in our information locally, because the media outlets near us, either in Burlington or in Montpelier, and statewide, they kind of covered things at a much higher level than the local level for a little town like ours. So where we might have been getting statewide news, we weren't necessarily finding out like what's open and closed in our town. Are our town offices open? How do we know, like what restaurants are open for takeout? all those sorts of things. And eventually, how to get a COVID test, etc. So there needed to be some place for that kind of information to come out. We have a thing in Vermont called Front Porch Forum, which is an online website that's these little town by town forums that are distributed by email every day. And that was sort of the only thing that was connecting people at that point, was their daily email that they would get from Front Porch Forum, where people would post things, questions or announcements, etc.
So when the Waterbury Record closed, it left a local journalism news void, if you will, a news desert, as they're sometimes described. Tell us how the Roundabout came to be, why it was launched, and how it's now filling that void.
Well, it essentially started as a class project, which, I think about it now, we didn't really know what we were starting at the time. We weren't sure, we didn't look that far into the future. We just sort of saw this need. And at the time, I was working at the University of Vermont part-time as an editor and a mentor with students who were from a variety of different majors, but were all interested in journalism. And they were doing this internship program that's called the Community News Service. And I would work with the students to help assign and edit stories that they would produce that would then go out to be placed in a variety of different local newspapers and online news outlets, whether there's probably about a half a dozen different publications that we worked with in and around Burlington, which is where the university is. And so at the time when all of a sudden we saw the Waterbury news evaporate, and I live in Waterbury, you know, I went to the folks that I'm working with there at UVM to say, what if we turn some of this energy and attention that we have with this group of students, what if we start covering some Waterbury news, which we really had not been doing at that point. And they said, sure, why not? You know, I mean, it was just as good as anything else that we were covering. So at that point, one of my students was sort of the web wizard in our group, and she designed a website. And we started putting together some assignments. Our timing wasn't great because by the time this was like the end of March when the paper folded. It was the end of April by the time we kind of got this up and running, and then the semester was soon to be over. So that was a little tricky, but we launched the first week of May, and we announced our arrival on the Front Porch Forum email thing that I just mentioned, to get the word out. And then other people in town just started sharing the link to our website. And before long, people just started signing up on our website. We created a weekly newsletter that we started to distribute the first week of June. I ended up with students that were still working with me over the summertime because the program continued during the summer. At that point, I was no longer the supervisor for the summer. I kind of shifted to start working on this Waterbury project. And that went into the fall as well. So I've had like the support of a few students in that program throughout. And they've been, you know, they've been sort of isolated like everybody else has been. A lot of their reporting has been done like this, you know, on Zoom and phone calls, et cetera. But a lot of the things they're covering are being held this way too. They're missing out a little bit on that in person, you know, interviewing people where they live and work. But it's been great to have their support. But then along the way, there were also people in our community that pitched in. Gordon Miller is one of my partners, and he's a news photographer, and he was the main shooter for the Waterbury Record and still works for that newspaper group with their other newspapers. He lives in Waterbury, so he's been a huge help. If you look at our website, much of what populated our site to get started were his photos from his library of all the photos that he had here shot in Waterbury. And so that kind of helped breathe some life into it. And he goes around and he helps shoot things for the stories that the students might be reporting on. I also had a good friend who used to publish a weekly paper in our community called Exit 10, and that was a while back. And she's retired now, but was super supportive and helped sort of talk things up in the community. And I've had a handful of other sort of part-time journalists who've been happy to do freelance in the beginning for free, which was huge. And you know, if you look, a lot of the bylines so far have been mine, but there's been a lot of contributors that are now starting to regularly participate and are starting to cover things. And we've been able to do some fundraising so that I've been able to start paying contributors as well.
That's fantastic. It's great to hear that you have all of the support within the community to help this publication thrive. What kind of news or information specifically are you providing that the community was missing when the record closed? What kind of affairs are you covering?
Oh, we're covering, you know, what our local select board's doing. We're covering our school board. We're doing feature stories on people in the community that are doing things differently, whether it's businesses having to adapt, whether it's people helping provide meals for folks who are out of work. There have been a whole bunch of stories of like we just call them like acts of kindness, but people sort of going out of their way to do things for other people that are sort of, you know, unusual circumstances and stuff. We've had children who are doing all sorts of interesting things, that they're home and doing school part-time remotely, et cetera. We had one story about a little girl who got online on some writing group with her aunt in Texas, turned her onto some writing group that was an organization in Texas. And her story that she wrote was sort of picked in this writing group. And it ended up that a company in Austin, Texas saw her story and then donated a pile of money to their local food bank based on this little girl's story. And she's right here in Waterbury. There were another kid who decided to start making donuts on Fridays for her neighbors. And she would take orders and she'd go and she would deliver them to their neighbors, to their porches, and she'd leave donuts on their porch. So we're trying to find like these, you know, those little stories that are, you know, little glimmers of brightness, but also, you know, covering, you know, how many COVID cases are in our community and how can you get tested and how are the businesses adapting and struggling, et cetera. Our ice rink, like many ice rinks, turned up the heat and melted the ice and did repairs over the summer, but we had no skating happening in our ice rink. So trying to figure out all the things that are different and to tell people about them.
Right. So, and it might be obvious to us and those that work in newsrooms and those that advocate for the free press, but for those that may need a reminder, why is this news, why is this information so important? Why is it so valuable to our communities to have this type of information provided to us through a publication like yours?
Well, it's interesting. We live in a time right now where everybody is so immersed. They're online a lot and they're immersed in information from so many different sources. But there's not a lot of sources of information about what's happening right here in your town. And you can't just rely on people chatting on Facebook and Twitter and that sort of thing to sort of know what's happening. So when your town council is talking about, how are we going to handle our tax payments this year? Let's decide that we're only going to collect taxes once and we're going to do it in November and give people the longest time to pull together their tax payments. We tell them about that. When the school board is having discussions about how do we reopen our schools in September, do we do them remote? Do we do it hybrid? What would that look like? What are all the questions? They're doing these Zoom meetings and stuff. We're making sure that we're telling people that these meetings are happening. We're covering them, showing them links on how to connect. And people right now are so, especially through most of last year where we were on this sort of lockdown for such a long time. And it was all new to us. People were really disconnected, even just from the people on their own streets. I'd go to the grocery store, I'd be out in town and people would stop me everywhere I would go to say, thank you for doing this. This is how I'm staying connected. This is how I know what my neighbors are doing, And so in addition to just sort of the hard news, we would try to include stories every week that were sort of feature stories too, to sort of explaining like what people were up to. And lots of pictures. People love photos and it's been exciting for me because I've always worked in print and to just have a website where we could, and Gordon, our photographer too, loves this because normally if he shoots, photos for a story, they'd maybe run a couple shots with a story, but we could throw up a dozen pictures with a story now on an online story. And people are enjoying that so much because they're getting to see things that are happening that they aren't seeing themselves in person.
Hearing all of this, I wonder, was there a model that you looked at when you created the Roundabout, or perhaps you were looking to create a model that others in various communities could emulate? Is there any kind of precedent for what you're doing here?
Well, I previously had been managing editor at two small weekly newspapers. And so I kind of just, drew from that, if I was putting a 12-page paper together or a 16-page paper together this week, what would go in it? And I kind of started there. And so some of it is original reporting. People send us little announcements and we do the equivalent of like little news briefs. And I realized early on that the visual thing was really big with people, and that people were so, staying to themselves that like when something would happen, for example, at Christmas time, our Rotary had a Santa in the park where the children usually go and see Santa in person. And it was like a drive-by Santa in the park. And Santa and his elves had like these fishing poles with little gifts on the end. And they would, put gifts into the cars with fishing poles. And we took all these pictures and people loved being able to see that because not everybody saw it themselves, but you were able to kind of have that window into what's going on in the community. So even though people might be cooped up at home, they can still get a little bit of a glimpse of what's happening out there.
That's great. And before we wrap up here, I'm sure there are some that are going to be watching this video that want to create similar publications for their own communities to fill that type of news void. Where would they turn for funding, for example, or the resources needed to create a similar publication? Where does your support come from, for example?
I'm still working on that. One of the biggest things that helped us launch was the fact that I had this relationship and still do with the folks at the University of Vermont. I mean, they're still hosting our website, which is huge. And it's a student who just graduated in December. She's still doing our website for us. We're using the Squarespace platform as far as like the website that we built. So they were super helpful in at least getting us our presence online. We have a free MailChimp account that we're using to distribute our newsletter every week. And we've got over 1,400 subscribers there now. We are starting to do some sponsorship ads on our newsletter, which is helpful. We did a partnership with NENPA, which is the New England Newspaper and Press Association, had a campaign that they helped a lot of newspapers in New England raise money through a nonprofit foundation of their own through December. And we managed to raise $7,000 that way in a few months last fall, which was great. And the other big thing that we've done, which I hadn't talked about, is that we've actually launched a print publication too. So the newspaper, the daily paper in Montpelier called the Times-Argus, came to us, and they were also trying to recover from their COVID decline that they saw last year. And they were starting to mail a weekly free publication throughout central Vermont with some of their feature content from their daily paper. And they came to us and they said, you're doing all these Waterbury stories. We could customize the version that goes to your town with your stories. And so that was huge, because so many people, despite the fact that we're online, would come to me and say, when are you going to do a paper? We miss having a paper. We miss having the news that we could touch and hold and read in our hands and not on our computers. And I didn't know how to do that. I didn't know how I could possibly do that too. And so the Times-Argus was already going to be mailing something to everyone. And they said, let's make it more relevant and put the Waterbury Roundabout stories in it. So that launched, I don't know if you can see, that launched in November. So this was like, welcome to our collaboration, and it's called The Waterbury Reader. It comes out weekly now. And I send them about a half a dozen stories and pictures. And that goes out. We had a story on dog mushing in our town last week. So now this goes to every house in our community, and they're paying us for our content.
It's fantastic.
So, you know, it's not huge yet. I mean, but we are able to pay the people who aren't students who are contributing now, which is a good first step.
Any suggestions for those watching this video that want to either support you in the Roundabout or just want to support local journalism generally? What can they do to help?
Well, I think one thing I've seen across the board with all the news organizations, at least in Vermont, that I'm familiar with, whether they're for-profit or nonprofit, just about every news organization right now is doing some sort of a campaign or some sort of an effort to say, if you like what we do, if you use what we do, support us. I would say go to the websites of the news organizations that you use and you value. And I bet you can find a spot on all of their websites where you can contribute in some way to help them, and do that. I don't even want to count how many I subscribe to myself, but I subscribe to a lot and contribute to a lot, because I feel like if I go there, I should be helping them do their work. We have a donate button at the top of our website, which is waterburyroundabout.org, and we can still do that here as well. But for anybody who might be thinking about doing something like this, it's not that hard, and there's not a lot of overhead needed right now, you know, especially with everybody so into this mindset of working from home, et cetera, that you really could start putting things together without, you know, much of a budget and without a whole lot of effort. It's easy to build a website. It's easy, you know, you need people who are willing to do the work and put the pieces together, but it doesn't have to be a really expensive proposition.
Thanks so much for describing your work, and best of luck to you and your team at the Roundabout.
Thanks so much, Justin. I really appreciate it.